Well, this weekend, the death of Cuba's former president Fidel Castro occurred, and that was at the age of 90. The deputy chair of the African Union Commission said the modern history of Africa owes a lot to Cuba and the late leader Fidel Castro. Joining me now on Skype is Siya Beniza. He's Finance and Operations Director at PESA. Siya, good evening to you. Castro and his role in Africa, how important was it?
Castro had a very important role, especially in a lot of liberation movements on the continent. Two particular involvements were his military engagements in Ethiopia and in Angola in the late 70s and 80s. This was very decisive, especially in the end of apartheid for South Africa, particularly in his military activities in Angola, which at the time led to an embarrassment for the apartheid government, which was backing the opposition party there, UNITA. And that war was very decisive in creating the kind of political environment where the apartheid government was weakened and created momentum for the liberation struggle, and indirectly had an impact also on the independence of Namibia, which came right after the military activities in Angola.
Well, certainly a direct result was the independence in Namibia, and certainly arguably set in motion the developments in South Africa that led to democracy. So ironic, though, that two democracies in Southern Africa were created and they've remained true democracies. But as you say, the impetus came from a man who was running a socialist dictatorship, certainly not a democracy. There's an irony there.
Yes. Well, if you were so aware of his history as a person, had a strong view against imperialism. And although this can be seen sort of hypocritical given the current or the political structure that existed in Cuba, what he was really fighting against in the African continent was the proxy wars that were happening as part of the Cold War in the late 60s and early 70s. And that was very successful in delivering a lot of freedom for African citizens, and it's been lauded as the only time when a foreign interference or there was foreign intervention that led to greater freedom and better living conditions for Africans. Generally, I mean, the colonial past has shown us that external interference has actually led or retarded development and led to oppression of African people on the continent.
Well, it's certainly in the 1980s, the Cuban forces in Angola, there were Russian forces and advisors there. South Africans, as you say, there were a number of players there. Now, with that war finished and Angola in a different place, Cuba's influence in the last 20 years, since the end, 25 years since the end of that war and the gaining of democracy, what is Cuba's influence now and role in Africa?
Well, Cuba still has a very strong influence and an impact on Africa, especially through its assistance with doctors on the continent and teachers, and as well as the kind of political training that it offers for some of our security officers and politicians generally on the continent. But the Cuban history is quite interesting because it's a small little island and was really able to take advantage of its geopolitical position, really, and it was taking advantage of its alignment with the Soviet Union. However, since the dismantling of the Soviet Union and the subsequent rise and dominance of capitalism, the influence of Cuba has diminished. And if you might remember, in the early 90s, they were faced with severe economic crisis, and even to this day are still faced with some of the historical legacies of these economic disruptions that have occurred in Cuba. So although they have had a very meaningful impact on African freedom and liberation, generally the overall struggle of socialism or communism against capitalism has been lost.
That is Siya Beniza, Finance and Operations Director at PESA.